The flames spread across the hills like an unstoppable wave, consuming everything in its path. The air was thick with smoke, the heat unbearable. The fire raged on for hours, swallowing entire neighborhoods, leaving behind only charred remnants of what once was. In the midst of the chaos and devastation, there was one house that stood tall, untouched by the inferno. A single home, standing defiant, while thousands of others were reduced to ashes. How could this be? How did this house survive when everything else around it was gone? This wasn't just another story about a fire. It was a story of survival, mystery, and something much larger than anyone could have anticipated. When the firestorm hit Los Angeles, it seemed like nothing could escape its grasp. People fled their homes in terror, watching in disbelief as the flames devoured entire communities. For many, their homes were lost forever, their lives upended in a matter of hours. The fire's path was random, unpredictable, and yet, this one house remained. Was it luck? Was it something more? The survivors who witnessed the horror from their driveways, the neighbors who saw their homes crumble in an instant, none of them could explain it. The house was surrounded by devastation, with nothing left but smoldering ruins. Yet, standing firm amid the ashes, the house seemed almost like a symbol, a strange anomaly in an otherwise tragic landscape. As firefighters battled the blaze, the question loomed: how did this house escape when so many others had fallen? Experts, firefighters, and even locals were left scratching their heads. Some said it was the way the house was built, with materials that somehow withstood the heat. Others claimed it was the way the wind blew, creating a pocket of safety around the house. But none of these theories could fully explain the mystery. The house had survived where others had not, and the mystery only deepened as the fire finally began to subside. In the aftermath, as residents returned to their neighborhoods, the house became a symbol of hope and disbelief. People gathered around it, taking pictures, whispering theories, and wondering if there was something more to this story than met the eye. Was it just sheer coincidence, or was there something special about this house? What was the real story behind its survival? And most importantly, was it really as safe as it seemed? As the investigation into the fire's origin continued, new details began to emerge. Could the house's survival be linked to something larger? Was it a stroke of fate or something else entirely? What secrets might it hold that would shed light on how it stood unscathed in the face of such destruction? But before we dive into the theories and unravel the story behind the house, one question remains: what happened to the people who lived there? And why didn't they return when the fire had passed? Was it just a matter of time before the truth came to light? Or was the story of this house just the beginning of something far more mysterious, something even more dangerous than the fire itself? Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. The fire had started on the dry hillsides, a small spark that quickly turned into an inferno. Winds picked up, fanning the flames, making them grow larger and faster than anyone could have predicted. People who lived in the area had long feared that one day the fire season would hit hard, but no one was prepared for the devastation that would unfold. As the fire spread, evacuations became a frantic race against time. The sirens screamed, and the streets filled with cars, packed with belongings and people who didn't know what they were going to return to. Among the chaos, a few stories of survival stood out. There was Jake, a firefighter who had barely escaped with his life after getting trapped while battling the flames. He had always been told that the fire season was a risk they lived with, but standing there, covered in ash, staring at what was left of his neighborhood, he couldn't help but feel like he had failed. He had been so focused on saving others that he hadn't realized how close the fire had come to his own home. He had driven out just in time, leaving behind everything he had worked for. Then there was Maria, a mother of two, who had lived in a house not far from the one that had mysteriously survived. When the fire came, she thought she'd be able to make it out in time, but the smoke and flames spread faster than she had anticipated. She'd barely made it out with her children, and her heart sank as she drove away, looking back at her house, the place where her family had made countless memories. Now, it was gone. All that was left were the smoldering remains, just another casualty of the fire. But there was one thing that stood out to Maria. Across the street, standing alone in the middle of the field of charred ruins, was a house that still stood. She couldn't make sense of it. How had it not burned? Was it luck? Or was it something else? While Maria tried to rebuild her life in a shelter, with her children clinging to her side, she couldn't stop thinking about that house. She asked around, but no one seemed to have an answer. The homeowners had vanished, no one could find them, and there was no one left to speak about the house's strange survival. That was when she heard the rumors. Some people said the house had been abandoned before the fire. Others whispered about a mysterious family who lived there, but no one knew for sure. As the weeks passed, the house remained untouched, a stark reminder of the fire's random cruelty. Jake had seen the house too. As a firefighter, he'd been part of the team that combed through the area after the fire was finally brought under control. He remembered the moment when he first saw it, the only house left standing. At first, he thought it was just a weird coincidence. But as he walked closer, something about it felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but it felt different. Maybe it was the way it was situated, surrounded by ashes. Maybe it was the fact that it was the only building that hadn't been reduced to rubble. Either way, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this house than he had first thought. The deeper he dug into the history of the property, the more questions arose. The house, it turned out, had been built by a man named Richard Green, a wealthy businessman who had made his fortune in tech. He was known for being reclusive, someone who preferred his privacy over company. But Richard hadn't been seen for years, and his house had been largely forgotten by the locals. In fact, it had been abandoned for nearly a decade before the fire. No one really knew why he left. Some said he had died, others said he had disappeared off the grid. Either way, the house had been left to decay, neglected by time and nature. So when the fire came, no one thought it would be standing when the smoke cleared. But it was still there, standing tall against the horizon. And it wasn't just the house that intrigued Jake, it was the land. The property was vast, stretching for miles in all directions, a rare find in a city as crowded as Los Angeles. It had once been a luxurious estate with gardens, fountains, and a sprawling mansion that made even the wealthiest people in the city envious. But the land had been abandoned for years, slowly falling into disrepair. Now, after the fire, it looked like a ghostly remnant of a bygone era. It was as though time had stopped in this small corner of the world, frozen in place while everything else around it burned. Jake wasn't the only one who found the house fascinating. As news of the fire spread, people from all over started to show up, drawn by the mystery of the surviving house. Some were curious locals, some were reporters hoping to get a scoop, and others were conspiracy theorists, suggesting that the house had been somehow protected by secret technology or supernatural forces. Every day, more and more people arrived, walking past the remains of burned homes and gathering at the foot of the house, staring up at its walls with wide eyes, searching for answers. As the weeks went by, the tension in the community grew. People had begun to ask questions that no one could answer. Was the house really as untouched as it seemed? Was it truly safe to be near? Some of the neighbors had started to gossip about strange occurrences. Flickering lights in the windows, odd sounds coming from the house late at night, and figures glimpsed in the shadows. But every time someone went to investigate, they found nothing. The house stood as silent and still as ever, like a monument to something that could not be explained. Maria, still trying to rebuild her life after the fire, was drawn back to the house time and time again. Every day, she would find herself standing at the edge of the property, looking at the house from a distance. She couldn't understand why she felt so compelled to go back, but something inside her told her that there was a deeper truth waiting to be uncovered. And then one night, as the full moon bathed the house in its light, Maria saw something that made her blood run cold. The front door creaked open, and a figure stepped out, silhouetted against the flames that still flickered in the distance. It was a man, tall, thin, with a dark shadow hanging over his face. He didn't seem like he was from the neighborhood, and he wasn't acting like anyone who had been affected by the fire. For a moment, everything went quiet. Maria's heart raced. Who was this man? And what did he want with the house that had survived everything? The answers would have to wait, but one thing was clear. The mystery of the house was far from over, and the people connected to it were about to be drawn into something much bigger than they could have ever imagined. Something dark, something dangerous, and the truth was waiting to be uncovered, if they could survive long enough to find it. Maria stood frozen, her eyes locked on the figure that had just emerged from the house. She felt her pulse quicken, her breath shallow, as the man slowly made his way down the steps, his movements deliberate and calm, as if the chaos of the fire and the world around him didn't matter. For a split second, she wondered if it was all just her imagination, but the longer she stood there, the more she realized this wasn't some trick of the mind. This was real. The man, now closer, stopped at the edge of the property. He didn't seem to notice Maria standing there, hidden in the shadows of the burnt landscape. He stood perfectly still, staring at the remains of the neighborhood, as if reflecting on something deep within. It wasn't until he spoke that Maria's blood ran cold. "I know you're there." His voice was low and measured, not angry, but certain. "I've been waiting for you." Maria stepped back, her heart racing. She had no idea who this man was, but his words struck a chord. How could he have known she was there? And why had he been waiting for her? "Who are you?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man turned to face her, his features slowly becoming clearer in the dim light. His face was sharp, his eyes intense, and there was something almost familiar about him, like she had seen him somewhere before, but couldn't place where. "I am Richard Green," he said, and the name hit Maria like a wave. The same name she had heard in the rumors. The same name that had been connected to the mysterious house. "I'm the one who built this place, and I'm the one who made sure it survived." Maria's mind was racing. Richard Green, the reclusive billionaire. The man who had vanished without a trace. The man who, it seemed, had not only survived the fire, but somehow caused his house to stand untouched by the flames. You're alive," she managed to say, still struggling to process the shock of it all. "Barely," he replied, with a wry smile. "But I've had help. My house, this property, it's part of something much bigger than just bricks and mortar. It was built with something more than money. Something that, I feared, would be misunderstood if anyone found out." Maria was speechless. She had heard whispers about the house being different, about it possibly being connected to some kind of secret, but she never imagined it would lead her here. To Richard Green. To the truth. He took a few steps closer, then stopped, looking her in the eye. "You're one of the few who survived the fire, and I need you to understand. This was no ordinary fire. It was a warning. A test." Maria's mind reeled. A test? A warning for what? Richard paused, his gaze hardening. For what's coming next? Before she could respond, the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. A distant rumble, low, but growing louder. The air itself seemed to shift, thickening with tension. Richard's face darkened. The fire was just the beginning. He continued, his voice now edged with urgency. The fire was a catalyst. There are others who want this land. They want its power, its secrets, and they will stop at nothing to get it. The tension in the air was palpable as Maria tried to process what Richard had just said. The fire, the house, the strange feeling of the place. It all made sense now, but it also opened up more questions. What power did this house hold? Why had Richard Green left? And why had he come back now? "You're not just here to survive," Richard added, his voice low. "You're here to protect it. To protect us." Maria felt a sudden wave of fear. This wasn't just about rebuilding her life anymore. This was something much bigger. But before she could respond, the ground shook again, and a shadow loomed on the horizon. In the distance, smoke began to rise again. It was as if the fire was coming back, but this time, it wasn't just flames. It was something more, something darker. Richard turned, motioning for Maria to follow. "Come on, we have to move quickly." Maria hesitated for only a moment, then followed. They rushed into the house, its doors creaking open as if welcoming them back. Inside, the house was strangely untouched, the air cool and calm, as if time had stopped. "This house," Richard explained as they moved through its empty halls, "has been built with something unique. A material that's not just fire-resistant, but resistant to time itself. It's connected to the land in a way no one understands. And he paused, looking at her with a deep intensity, have spent my life protecting its secrets." As they reached the basement, Richard's voice grew more serious. "The fire was meant to test whether the land could be defended. But the real test is coming. And it's not just about fire. It's about power, about control. And we are standing in the way of those who will do anything to seize it." Maria's heart pounded as she followed Richard into the dark basement. There, she saw something that made her stop dead in her tracks. A massive vault, its steel door etched with strange symbols, symbols that seemed almost alive. Richard moved toward it, his hand resting on the door. "This is it," he said softly. "This is what they want." As the vault door creaked open, a blinding light erupted from within. It was as though the house itself was alive, pulsing with energy, protecting something far greater than anything Maria had imagined. The truth was right there, but before she could take it all in, the house began to tremble once more. The rumbling from outside grew louder. "It's happening," Richard muttered. "They're here." Maria's mind spun as she tried to understand what was unfolding before her eyes. What had she gotten into? What was this secret Richard had been guarding for so long? And who were they who were coming to take it? The vault door opened fully, revealing an object that glowed with an ethereal light. Richard turned to her with a grave expression. "It's too late to turn back now," he said. "You've already been pulled into this. We have to protect it, no matter what happens." And just as the first shadowy figures appeared at the door, Maria understood. This wasn't just about survival. This was about a battle far bigger than herself, a fight for control over something that could change everything. The house wasn't just a survivor of the fire, it was a key. And now, it was up to her to decide which side she would be on when the world outside came crushing in. As the figure approached and the vault's light pulsed once more, Maria realized that the story was far from over. It was only just beginning.